Okay, so I think this should be working now. Um, let's see. I'm so bad with Google Hangouts, but anyway, remote work. Um, I have worked remotely, remote first and pretty much remote only for my entire life. I've done it through open source. I've done it through teaching. I ran a code school for a couple of years. And I've also built an agency from the ground up with a friend of mine that has been remote only for 12 years. And it's funny because when I had first started working remotely, with the exception of the open source world where there's kind of no other alternatives, it was pretty much a rare thing for people to work remotely. And now I feel like it's much less so. I feel like it's a lot more common. However, it seems like people still struggle with the idea of what it means to work remotely and whether it is the same kind of work just distributed or if it's really a different kind of work. And I've always felt that remote work works best when you treat it as a completely different style of work than what you would do with a co-located team in a single location. And the reason for that is straightforward. If you're working remotely, you have the advantage of having the whole world and all of our time zones and all of the people in the world available to you. When you're not working remotely, you're in one place. The advantage of having everybody in one place is being highly synchronized with one another. It's having close connections with the people you're working with and all of that sort of stuff. The advantages of remote are mostly the opposite of that. And so the thing that always surprises me are when teams who want to work remotely want to recreate the experience of working on site somewhere. That doesn't work at all. At least that's not something that I feel works well. Hold on, just so that's close Skype. Okay, so to me, remote work works best when you are actually treating everything you do as sort of a product or a service that you provide both internally to your team, to clients, as well as the users of software that you build. And the reason why I think it works best that way is because remote work only ever works out well when there's a high level of trust within a team. And the most direct way to gain that trust is by actually delivering valuable work. I think that when teams work together closely in a physical location, it can be easy to start looking at things in terms of internal goals and kind of like just working together with a focus on the team, right? With remote work, the focus has to be to some extent on the product because you don't interact in the same ways or at the same degree that you would in a person, like in an in-person setting. So you have to let your work lead. And this can be a very good and very powerful thing about remote work. It's critically important. You don't have those, at least there's not a natural way to have the kind of interactions that you would have in a casual on-site setting where you build trust through just running into someone in the hallway and having conversations with them and that sort of thing. In a remote setting, you are a lot of times working on your own, or you're working intentionally with other people rather than bumping into them casually. And also, if you're truly taking advantage of remote work, you are taking advantage of the asynchronous nature of remote work. And what that means is you're not always working at the same time as other people, and you aren't always directly interacting with other people. And because of that, you actually have to communicate through shipping things. And I think that this is a challenge for people because in a on-site workplace, status updates and things like that can be indicators of progress, where in a remote team, you have to actually deliver. And I think that's, I don't know, maybe that's a bias of mine, but at the same time, this is what I've seen works, right? And let me try to be a little bit more specific about that. When we build things for customers or clients as a remote team, a lot of the times, rather than trying to get everybody to get together on a conference call or a video chat or what have you, we instead will have a lot of ad hoc conversations for quite a while around the different problems that exist within a problem space. So we basically tell our clients, our customers, to talk to us about whatever's going on in their work, whatever challenges they're facing, the things that they might need help with, so on and so forth. And then when those people come share that information, what we'll start to do is start to think, okay, how can we come up with some way to help them, right? How can we solve some of these problems? What's something that we can come up with a solution to? And so rather than sending like a detailed proposal around what we want to do, tend to lean heavily on proof of concept and prototyping and things like that. Because when you can actually put together, even if it's just a mock-up or a set of examples or a spreadsheet or whatever, when you can put together an actual artifact, and you could be aiming for something that takes anywhere from 15 minutes if it's a wireframe sketch to a few hours if it's a quick prototype of something. And then when you do have the conversation with the customer, you just put that thing in front of them, right? And you've already listened for quite a while to the problems that they're facing. You've asked some good questions. You've maybe asked for access to this piece of data and that piece of data and so on and so forth. But then when you actually sit down to work, it can be very difficult in a remote setting to get fluid feedback when it comes to making decisions, because the people that you need to work with might not be able to give you the information that you need at the time that you need it. And so it's very risky to leave. It's very risky to leave a lot of open questions. I find leaving a lot of questions open or saying, oh, what do you think in general about this idea that I'm trying to describe to you through a long email or through a phone call? That doesn't work very well. And because your time cycles might be in a remote setting, especially in an agency setting where you're not talking to the client every single day. You might talk to them once every couple of weeks in terms of actual formal decision-making interaction. And so you want to use that time wisely, and you want to come with something, right? So you listen. You get a sense of what they might need help with. You build some small artifact, and then you put that in front of them, and you say, what does this look like to you? Does this look like it could work? Should we develop it? And putting that thing in front of them is a very powerful form of conversation and very powerful form of feedback, because it separates the ideas in the head around things. And that's one of those things that if you were not working in a remote setting, you could more easily work out, because you could have a couple one-off interactions with people and that sort of thing, where it just face-to-face, you talk through it and you figure out where you might have been wrong about something and that sort of thing. But when you're working remotely and you're thinking, all right, I've got 15 minutes or 20 minutes of this person's time, and the next scheduled conversation with them might be weeks out, then putting something in front of them and saying, does this look like it's useful to you? Does it look like it could solve the problem? is a very powerful thing to do, because a few hours of work on a prototype, or even just, 15 minutes of time putting together a wireframe or something like that, can save days of back and forth asynchronous emailing sort of conversations with people, because you get so much feedback from someone trying to interact with the thing that you built. And also, you can learn very quickly if you're on the wrong path. But I guess the general idea there is you cannot rely, if you're trying to work efficiently in remote communications, you cannot rely on the kind of feedback you get from regular day-to-day interactions with people. Instead, you have to rely on the kind of feedback that you can get from putting something in front of someone, asking them to actually use the thing, asking them if it makes sense to use, if the idea that you have makes sense for their needs. And so you're kind of inverting the planning process, right? You're building first, or you're building continuously, and you're getting feedback on the thing that you built, and then you're figuring out what you need to build next based on the person's interaction with the software, rather than a long, protracted feedback conversation. Like, there are situations where if you try to decide what to build or what the priorities are over email, or even over through meetings, where that could go on for weeks or months of indecision, right? But if you put a concrete thing in front of someone that makes use of real or realistic data and reflects the things that they actually have been talking to you about, and that's the critical part about it, which is you tell everybody that you're working with, everyone on your team internally, every client, every customer, that they can talk to you whenever they want about the things that are on their mind. But then when it comes to actually build, you don't try to get consensus from a bunch of people before you build something. Instead, you build a tiny thing, you get feedback on it, and then if it was the wrong path, well, that's useful information. You found it in the period of anywhere from 15 minutes to a few hours of work, and then you burn it down and you try something else. But if it's on the right path, then they're going to ask you questions, right? You're going to start bootstrapping the concept. And so you use the thing, the actual product, to lead the communication, rather than the talking about it and the planning. And so I think this is the thing that's hard for people to get accustomed to, which is if you're someone who feels like your collaboration works best by talking, particularly if it's by just, tapping someone because you had an idea and you just want to talk to them about it. And then you want to start building, and then you want to have you want to be able to go over and immediately grab that person and pull them in to look at what you're doing and give you that feedback. Remote work is not good for that. It doesn't take advantage of the strengths of remote work, which is you should be able to work as a remote worker relatively independently day to day. And by the time you set down to actually do something, you should have some sense of what it is that you're doing. And again, you're treating it like a product or a service, right? You're separating your research from your development and your production work. And it seems like in many organizations, that's actually something that's just not well established in terms of if you are working in an on-site location. There's this idea of everything's always a work in progress, and there's this continuous flow back and forth of reprioritization and continuous discussion and feedback that just goes in all these different directions, and you're stuck in meetings and this sort of thing. It's really inefficient in a remote setting to work that way, so you have to separate the two. continuous conversation. It can be about stuff that is going to happen now or 6 months from now or a year from now. It doesn't matter. And then a very intentional build, get feedback, iterate loop is essential. And like, for example, I think in remote work, the idea of having fixed hours that people work can be disastrous. I think the idea of having fixed schedules where you try to plan out tasks on a micro level can be disastrous. I think an excess of meetings in a remote setting is disastrous. I mean, especially when you're talking about synchronous meetings, if there's a heavy use of video communication, what you are doing is you're trying to establish, if you're using a lot of real-time video communication, then what you're trying to do is you're trying to force a on-site based workflow onto remote work, and it does not work well at all. It's not even the technology hurdles of having to use tools that don't always work reliably. It's the interruption from it, and it's the structure of it. Because if you need daily communication to get remote work done, then you have not effectively productized or servicized. Yeah, I'm not sure if that's a word, but you've not effectively created an environment that takes advantage of the isolation of responsibilities that you can get from remote workers. I even think that if you have too much, like you're using Slack, right? And if you have to ping people constantly on a daily basis or email people constantly, it's actually a sign of a poorly functioning remote team. From a remote first perspective, it's a sign of a poorly functioning team. And that's kind of a strange thing to say, right? Because, in theory, if you have daily meetings over video chat and you have continuous support through Slack and you have you can access people by email whenever you need to, blah 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 blah, right? And you're always in communication, then it seems like you have like this cohesive team that is like very collaborative. Maybe you throw in even more than that, screen sharing and remote pairing and all of that stuff. I actually do not think that any of that should be a primary part of a remote first design. I just don't. And so what I actually believe is in a remote first environment, you are trying to build a platform rather than a team. And that platform exists to support the members of the team as well as the customers and clients and so on that they serve and the organizations that they work within, you name it. But a remote team is actually a platform. It's not a real-time collaboration engine or whatever you want to call it. And so as a platform, a well-functioning remote environment tends to heavily favor some degree of specialization, which again is against what a lot of teams in an on-site structure prefer. But in a remote setting, I think it's perfectly healthy to have some developers that specialize in front-end development or some developers that specialize in kind of database modeling and low-level things around data analysis and so on and so forth. Some developers who specialize in project management and that sort of thing. And you can allow people to have individual strengths, but you also need people who can be relatively self-contained in the kind of work that they can do. And then you have to break up the work so that when you hand it off to someone, that the integration points are well defined. And What that means is when you hand a piece of work off to someone, it should be something that's within their comfort zone. And the parts that are not, you can then coordinate with other people to help on that. And honestly, the best way to do that, in my mind, if it's not something that is something that you want to develop a strength in, it's not to pair with the person and learn all of the details. It's to set aside some time to ask a few questions, right? And get some answers, or to break off a chunk of the work that you're doing and assign it to someone else on the team, let them take care of it, then review what they did afterwards, and then ask your questions after the fact. We've gotten really good at that, at least on the teams that I've worked on, about this idea of intentionally separating concerns so that, for example, we on one project have a pretty complicated data aggregation processing pipeline that deals with some ancient dental systems. And that's something that one person on the team had built and specialized in. And the rest of us don't really know how it works. And I mean, there's some vulnerability to that, right? But on the other hand, the way that we collaborate is not, all right, I'm going to pair with you for days or weeks in order to get some piece of that. It's, let's talk for a short while about how we can, how you could build a web service or something like that in front of this so that we can pass some data out to other systems that we're using. And then that makes it so that the interface between this big, complicated system that is in one person's head doesn't need to be understood by the rest of the team, because you just put an interface in front of it, and then all you need to do is talk about that little piece, right? And then once you have that piece, then everybody else can work as if it's just ordinary web development. So this idea of like cutting things up on the line of domain expertise and also technical expertise is totally natural in a remote setting. And it's much more effective if you're not trying to rely on a lot of real-time communication. And then from there, if you have that basis, this idea of when we want to share something with each other, when we want to cross the gap between my experience and yours, then we build some way of doing that, whether it's a web service, whether it's a library, whether it's, I don't know, I mean, a document that is, it gives you an overview of how you can use this one little piece of things. It's like you actually separate it, right? You don't actually share the knowledge directly, and you just separate it so that you only need to understand that connection point, and then that allows people to work separately from one another. Once you have that sort of stuff in place, then you really have to dig into the idea of documentation and systematizing things, and essentially starting to treat everything internally that you are building as services. And I don't necessarily mean that in a web service model, but in the sense of like, these things are meant to serve other people who use them for a number of purposes. And so they should be documented in the same way that something that you bought is documented. And to be honest, this is something that we've done fairly well in the open source world with. It's not something that our team has done super well with in the agency setting, but we're heading in that direction. And it's really a good practice. It's really a good practice to say, all right, instead of me pairing with you when you want to learn a piece of this or that, why don't I write a tutorial for you? And also, why don't I clean my junk up a little bit to make this a little bit simpler for you to use in the first place? And when you start getting into that mentality of like, from an internal basis of how do I make my stuff available to others, It's by actually publishing, documentation or video, or it's making it so simple that you just run a script, or it's having lots of good examples and so on and so forth. And you just start thinking from a remote organization's perspective. You actually want to enable other people to be self-sufficient. And that does not necessarily mean that everybody has to have identical skills, but it does mean that on the day-to-day level, you should be able to do most of what your job requires on your own. And when there's areas that are unknowns, you carefully and intentionally plan out how to build a connection point with someone else on the team or bring in their knowledge. And then you get through that as quickly as you can. You maybe make the investment to simplify it for the future, and then you move on, right? So again, it's like, it is fundamentally different because you don't go to that pairing level. You don't go to that let me sit down and teach you. You don't do a ton of lunch and learn type things. And so collaboration takes on a different form because you're trying to make the products and services and their associated documentation and support materials and the processes around things more self-service. And you do that by really thinking about the idea of customer service at every level of what you do. Every level. Everything that you build that needs to be touched by another human being, whether it's a developer, a client, a customer, or anyone, collaborators in other business, whatever, doesn't matter. Everything that you create is a product or a service that is going to be utilized by other people. And so you're not relying on that. Oh, that's the guy who built it. Let me just ask him to show me how to do it. Or that's the woman who made that piece, so let's have her come into the meeting as well. And that's the other thing. Like, I kind of got away with it for myself, but the whole point of this, the whole point of taking this product-driven mindset around everything is that it eliminates that idea of the 5, 6, 8, 20 person meeting. And that's the critically important aspect of this, because, the best remote environments are entirely self-service. And in order to get that, which you never do, it's an ideal, then the next best thing is one-on-one interaction, right? One-on-one interaction where one person interacts with the client, even though everybody's been listening, right? Maybe everybody's heard what's going on. Then one person comes up with a plan. They take point. They come up with the idea of what to build. They work with the client or the customer to decide what's going to be built. And then they pull in one by one the people that they need and the tools that they need to be able to do their job. And when you do that, making it so that everybody doesn't need to be there all at once, making it so that everybody doesn't need to come to an agreement all at once is a very powerful thing. It's also a difficult thing to do because if you don't do it on a continuous basis, then the actual coordination to get anything done takes too long. And so that's an aspect of this. The goal, in my mind, of a well-functioning remote team and a well-functioning remote agency or service or product is to make it so that the tools themselves are capable of being used in a self-service sort of way, and the interactions between people are only adding to the collective platform rather than a continuous ongoing requirement on communication. And it's a lot of work because it means that you need to be a capable product designer. It means you need to be a capable operator. It means you need to be an excellent communicator. And also, I think for a lot of people, that sort of team is not a team that they necessarily want to work on. I think the idea of building teams, and I mean this, I'm talking about software because that's what I'm familiar with, but I think this would apply equally well to any other kind of remote work. The idea of being on a team in which you're individually responsible for some area of things and also individually responsible for coordinating with the other people that you need to interact with, and on a one-on-one level and making decisions on that level, and then building things that can be reused without a whole lot of ongoing, continuing conversation is a critical aspect of remote work, but it's also one of the things that can feel isolating, it can feel lonely, it can feel overwhelming because you're managing these different connections. And I actually believe that it can be more efficient to work in this way of this sort of self-sufficiency, and to treat the business or the team as a platform rather than just an inner community of people working together. But I also worry that it takes a great deal of self-awareness and self-responsibility to be able to work in that sort of setting, because it means that everything that you do, you take responsibility for, and you are keenly focused on the experience, the product or service experience for the other person. So if a woman on your team needs to use the thing that you built to do her job, then you need to make sure that that thing pretty much can be used without too much interaction with you, because you've documented it well, because you've built the process well, because you've already taken into consideration what other people on the team might need by talking to them in advance before you built the thing, by making things flexible, by making things replaceable. This is a lot of burden, because you're basically shipping, right? You're releasing things in a remote setting. You're not just building things together in one big soup. And the reason why I say that is so important is because the feedback loops in a remote setting can get really disorganized and be extended for way longer than if you could just walk into someone's office and ask for something. I mean, you can take something that was supposed to be done in a day and have it stretched to a week or a month or a year because you're not there. You're not present in the office with like 3 other people who know exactly what you're doing and when you're doing it. There's not that sort of continuous rebalancing. So you can go off and be building your own thing for quite some time and then find out that that thing is no longer useful, right? And so the only way to prevent that from happening is to think about the idea of, all right, I've got a thing that is going to be useful to the team. I'm going to put it out there as quickly as I possibly can so that they can actually start using it. And then that drives the feedback loops that continue the discussions and the collaboration with one another. And it's funny because you have to think about like this idea of just shipping and 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 shipping. You have to think about it in every aspect of what you do. Every aspect of what you do. Every email conversation should lead with like whatever it is, spreadsheets, mock-ups, case studies, like user stories, things that are tangible, because conversation that plays like a slow game of ping pong back and forth, especially when there's open loop sort of questions, tend to sit there forever, right? If you ask an open-ended question with no examples and no demonstration in a remote setting, that question is going to sit in someone's inbox for who knows how long. And then, okay, enough of those accumulate, and then you got to call a meeting because you're locked on everything. That's not the way to do it. The way to do it is to come at it and say, all right, I think I understand the problem based on the things that you've said so far to me and the data that I have. Here is a story or an example or a scenario that uses the actual data that you gave me, the actual scenarios that you described, real business cases, so on and so forth. Does that sound right? And here are my specific questions around that. So you always want to have these sort of, like, the open loop conversations happen continuously. They're just the regular conversations. And then when you're actually planning and building, then it all has to be closed loop, if that makes sense. You always have to be putting something in front of someone and going, does that look right? Does that look like it's headed in the right direction? And getting a yes or no on that, and then getting the kind of guiding questions and the kind of feedback that's going to push you in the direction of what you can actually build. And you also have to be looking at it like, you have to have lots of different seeds planted at once, because you don't want to be blocked while you're waiting for this piece of feedback on this one thing. So you have to have a lot of things in varying states of done. It's important to say that, done, right? Because a bunch of work in progress that hasn't shipped is bad. It's very bad, especially in a remote setting, because it means that there might be 8 things that you've burned money and time on that are potentially valuable, but they are not valuable until they ship. So you're just burning money, and you're also building this tremendous feedback bottleneck, right? Because if you've got 8 things that you started but didn't ship, and you're waiting for feedback from a business person or on your team or from a client, then it just becomes this like, all right, I'm going to put it off, I'm going to put it off, I'm going to put it off, from their perspective, because of course they would. If you have 8 things that are blocked, you're going to take an entire day of someone's time to actually go through, or they're just going to pick the one thing that they care about and give you an answer on that one thing, or they're going to want to call a meeting and replan and reschedule, and then you're going to throw out 80% of that shit. You're just going to throw it out. It's going to sit. And so this idea of always want to be delivering things in a state of done and having many of them, you think of it like a portfolio, right? If you're in a remote setting and you're working with a client or you're working with a business that wants you to work on multiple things at once, which is every business, then you listen to everything that they want and you just make little beginnings on things. It could be a report. It could be, I don't know, it could be a tiny prototype that at least people can play with and try. It could be a video with a fake mocked up demonstration of something that, maybe it can't ship because the tool is not really implemented yet, but it can be used for feedback from someone else. They can pass it on to someone in marketing and get questions from them, so on and so forth. You got to be thinking like, what can I demonstrate? What can I deliver? And how can I do that with like the smallest amount of investment possible, so that there's this flexibility to constantly shift gears whenever you need to. Because we use this approach in my own work, I've found that you can tell us that you want to shift gears on a plan that we made months ago and have been just working along. We can shift gears in a matter of days and not lose anything, because essentially continuously delivering pieces. And when I say continuous, I mean continuous. I mean, an hour of work gets shipped, 5 hours of work gets shipped, or at least is in a release ready state. Never, ever, ever go weeks on something and then have to put it on hold before it gets delivered. And this is super, super, super important, this idea of continuous delivery, because as a remote worker, as a remote team, people can just forget about you. Not to say they forget about you in the literal sense, but they get busy and you're not there, and you don't necessarily have the regular meetings and things like that that keep everyone together. And especially if you're like working in a contractor setting, your client disappears because the client is busy. They have a whole business to run and you're just building some piece of it. And so if they disappear for a long time and everything that they had told you that was important months ago that you had started building has not been delivered, and you've just been working for it could be weeks, I mean, or days, right? And you're not delivering, you're not handing work in that is ready to go, you can end up throwing out everything. Or, you build up a lot of work with a lot of questions and a lot of speculation. You're blocked on a bunch of things. And then suddenly, because things are less busy, the person pops back up and then gives you a ton of feedback. Meanwhile, once you get all that feedback back, you are now shifting gears from whatever it was that you were actually working on. This kind of thing can happen all the time. Now you're blowing the dust off of all this old stuff and you're trying to get it to work again. And then maybe working against a deadline. These kind of things just don't work. Basically, in a remote setting, always be ready to deliver and always be delivering, because people may not, when you're in someone's email asking questions or asking feedback on abstract things before something's been implemented, you're a distraction. You're a responsibility. You're someone else's to-do list, basically. But when you can coach it in terms of delivery, you do a lot of powerful things, because now it's like an actual gift arriving in someone's inbox. We have this new capability. It's ready to go. Do you want us to do A, B, and C, continue on this thing, or should we shift gears to the next thing? And if you can make it work that way, then it works really, really well, because you're continuously delivering, right? And this idea of continuous delivery in a remote setting is critically important, because of the lack of internal status updates, because of the lack of internal conversations in which, let me just try to give this an example. If you were working on site and the person that you reported to suddenly just stopped showing up to meetings, or they noticeably had become more stressed or whatever, right? You would start to get some indicators that that person was busy, that their priorities had shifted, that there were challenges that they had to deal with, so on and so forth. And so you get a lot of this sort of indicators of like what's going on. And you hear too, like, because maybe they didn't talk to you about the issue, but they talked to a friend of a friend and they got back to you, and it turns out that like they're worried because, I don't know, some deal fell through and now there's a funding crunch, or because there was some problem with some other system that some other team is working on, and now that's creating a lot of headaches. You get that rumor mill flowing, and then like you can, if you get out of your space and talk to other people, which you always should be doing, then you know what's going on. But if you're a remote team and you're outside of the central, or maybe there is no central location of the business that you're serving, maybe they're all remote, but still, like, everybody's doing their own thing and you're not getting feedback. You just know that like you're not getting an answer, and you don't know whether it's because the person's busy with other things. You don't know if it's because of some emergency. You don't know if it's because they just forgot or whatever. You don't get that feedback. So the only way to make sure that your work is creating value is to actually put it into use. And so I think that's a fundamental difficulty with remote teams, is to understand that you have to carefully design your work to match the rhythm of the feedback that you can get, that you're working with limited information. At all times, you do not know where you sit in the priority orders of things, that you can't just grab someone and ask them in a hallway about something. And all of these things create a lot of challenges. But if you can make your work something where you deliver continuously, and especially like if you are working in an environment, either whether it's a business where you have responsibilities to many different stakeholders, or if you're in an agency and you have many different clients, then you give them some room to breathe. You give them some time for feedback. You don't need to rush to get the very next thing done for that one person. You deliver something, shipped, ready to go, one new feature. You begin the conversations about what the next thing is going to be. And if they get back to you, great. If they get you that feedback that you need, because like when you ship something, you should be reserving some time to deal with issues that might come up. And, don't overload yourself to the point where if someone has feedback and they want changes or they want to add on something that you can't act on it. But once you hand something to someone else and it's blocked on feedback, that's where you can start looking for something else that you could be doing that isn't blocked on that same person, or at least won't require their input for quite some time. Ideally not blocked on that same person, because if you get too far ahead of where someone's at in their feedback process, again, it goes to that problem that I mentioned before, which is the more work you're putting on someone else's plate, the more of a headache and the more difficult it is that they're going to be able, the more difficult it is for them to do the job that you need them to do to give you what you need. So the idea is, if you are separate and you're working on your own in a remote setting, then you want to make it so that your conversations with people are happening continuously, both on your end. It's probably just asking once in a while what's going on, like what people need. And also really inviting that, just talk to me about the problems that you're facing so I know, and talk to me early. Don't wait for me to finish what I'm doing. Don't wait for the right spot in the schedule. Don't push it through at the last second. Just talk to me about everything that you can about what's going on. Send me whatever data that you have around the problems that you're having, so that you just got this continuous flow of information coming to you. And then when you go to actual planning, you just got to do things and then ship them and get them the hell out of there. Then that's a feedback cut point. It's on someone else's plate. Don't pile more on top of it. Find another way, whether it's to go back and fix some small bugs, or to do chores or do things that don't require feedback. You switch to other stuff, or you go to another client or another customer, whatever. And so you limit the amount of stuff that you're pushing out into the world that's going to come back to you, so that you don't have these like crazy oscillations where you hear nothing for a long time because you're blocked on 8 things and then all 8 of those come back at you at once. And there's an art to that. And this idea of being able to simulate what the world outside of your own area of responsibility is, as well as to define clear boundaries so that people know what to expect from you and when, is critically important for any remote worker. Otherwise, you end up constantly stuck in those loops where you want an answer today, but the other person doesn't make space for you, or they do, but it's rushed. I don't know. I'm going to have to give that some more thought, because I think it's one of the biggest strengths that we practice, this idea of like conversation always, but like production being the separate flow. Like production is this very like, let's get in there, let's do the thing, let's move on to the next thing, and let's build just enough. I mean, if you've got 5 days or 10 days or 10 weeks of work that you're going to do and then get feedback on it, it is completely broken. It should be an hour, 5 hours, 2 days. And it should be timed along with, this is what we're going to do now. I'm going to hand it in at the end of the week. I'm going to hand it in 2 days from now. Please give me your feedback on it. Let me know if it's accepted or whether there's changes that you want. And then you just get in and out like that. I really don't think that a lot of the larger iteration, larger batch sort of workflows work well for remote work. I would be very suspect of like things where you try to plan a 2 or 4 week sprint or things like that. Even like planning a whole week of work, you know, in an agency setting, we have the luxury of not necessarily having to put in like a full work week for an individual client. Because to me, that's actually an incredible amount of capacity. And I'm amazed when the typical industry has like multiple people working full time on one project. It really, like, especially if they're all basically working on the same feature, like it has to be inefficiency that causes that, because that's mostly sitting around waiting time, right? That's mostly sitting around waiting time, or it's back and forth collaboration time, so on and so forth. But when you do it in a remote setting, and let's say you have a well-functioning team and you produce a lot of stuff, and then you're going to try to get feedback on, like, I don't know, 40 or 80 hours of work. Unless you have a very well-managed environment where the person who's going to give you the feedback is ready and totally able to do it properly, it's never going to work super well. It's always going to be like rushing into the next thing with it being poorly specified. It's always going to be the idea of like, oh, that's not quite done, but let's ship it and let's do the next thing, even though this shit is half broken. Or it's going to be, all right, let's add these 5 things from the last sprint onto the next sprint, and then just hope we'll put them at the bottom, the top of the bottom of the list or whatever, and we'll hope they'll get done. And then you end up with this like infinitely growing backlog. That's no way to work. And I think that you have those troubles when you have an on-site team trying to do these larger batches in multi-week or even multi-month projects. I don't know. I just feel like the idea that features and fixes and changes should live or die on their own, and you are managing a portfolio and you can do the $1,000 version of something or the $10,000 version of something or the $20,000 version of something. But if you're not starting with that $1,000 version, or ideally the $100 version, which is probably just a picture of something or a spreadsheet or whatever, like the idea of not stack ranking the investment by actually doing the work and then handing it over, that's something that's very surprising to me that people don't do. Because, for example, in the course of, you know, a week, I could put together 5 prototype or small incremental improvements for 5 different clients, and then listen to each one of them and then decide what to develop next, and then, you know, carve out time for the larger things. But trying to plan weeks or months of work in which you're trying to get feedback on that all at once is crazy to me. So, other things with remote work. Let's think. First, let me see if anybody had any questions. Interpersonal things where you say, okay, how do you still feel connected with people in your work socially? How do you feel connected if you're working from home or you're isolated from the rest of your team? This is another area where I'd say if you're really looking for that, if you're really looking to get your social interactions from your work, remote work is probably not the best thing for you to do. Now, there's many ways that you can be remote to a business, but on site in terms of like you can be part of a remote consultancy, but be on site with your client, and maybe that does it for you. Maybe that makes you feel like you've got that connection. But if you're trying to be part of a remote team and also have like that almost fraternal atmosphere of a workplace where people go out for beers afterwards or whatever, or like you feel like you have that strong need for, even if it's not social, but just the day-to-day human interaction. I actually don't think that remote work is super well fitted for that. I think remote work fits best the kind of person that wants to have some segmentation between their work responsibilities and their social responsibilities and their personal life. I pretty much cleanly and completely separate those things in my own work. And that works out just fine for me. I actually feel like sometimes when you can reduce down what you're doing for other people to a specific professional purpose, a set of services, a shared mission, you name it. I actually feel like in some ways that can actually feel closer and like a more productive and even like more intense interaction with people. But like we don't spend a whole lot of time talking about like what we watched on TV or how the kids are doing and so on and so forth. And it tends to be these professional interactions where it's like, I've got a thing that I'm good at that I can do for you, and you've got a thing that you're good at, and that's something that I'm trying to help you do or whatever. And you do the job, and you don't try to turn it into like that sort of deep connection on a personal level, because you find that elsewhere. And that's the upside, right? Like the upside is in a remote position where you're working from home or you're working from an office of your own or whatever, like you can go out in the middle of the day and go to a coffee shop and talk to people. You can do whatever you want. You can go and be with your family. You can go and hang out with your friends, so long as it doesn't interrupt your schedule. Now, this is where it gets confusing to me, because when people talk about, how do I keep social connections during remote work? And, I think I'm gonna tweet this again. Give me just a second. So yeah, in a remote setting, you're not necessarily going to get your social ties from the people that you're interacting with in work. I mean, there is there are teams where people probably do have that close tie, but it's still over the internet, and it's still like mixing your work and your social responsibilities. And I think it's not going to be the same as like being in a physical place with other people. And I think it's not necessary to try. If you want a lot of social ties, the benefit of working remotely, unless you work for a place that expects you to basically work a on-site type of schedule, but in a remote capacity, unless you work for one of those places like, oh, you check in at 8 a.m. on your Hangouts or whatever, and then you got to be on Slack for 8 hours a day because we want to make sure that you're working in those hours. Like, unless you're in that sort of place, you get to make your schedule however you want. Go out and do yoga at 10 o'clock in the morning. Go to a coffee shop at noon. Find out who works in your community, whether it's people in like the businesses that you serve through your work, or whether it's people who are developers or whatever your skill is, and just catch up with them. Grab lunch with people. Go for coffee. Go and talk to people. get your work done from like 6 to noon and then quit for the day and then go and hang out with your family or whatever. Like, use the flexibility of your remote work to allow yourself to create as rich of a social life as you'd like, but don't use your work as the vehicle for doing that. It's not that complicated, but it's something that people always worry about. I think part of it is that feeling of like, all right, now I work from home. I've got a flexible schedule, but the people that I know, a lot of people that I know don't. And so I can feel very isolated during the day. I don't like that. I feel like if things are going difficult with my work, I can't just go and talk to someone about it. I don't like that. Those are trickier problems. And I guess I could see where those things are things people struggle with. But at the same time, again, it just requires a little bit more work, a little bit more design. And that's fundamentally, I think, what's difficult about remote work for a lot of people, which is when you're working in an office and the office has a schedule and you have people that you work for there and there's a cadence to it. There's, this meeting on Monday and that meeting on Wednesdays, and you have your daily stand-ups and you have the lunchroom and you have the break room and you have the water cooler and you have blah, 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 blah. Right? There's all this structure to it that was put in there by someone else, and you just got to follow along. And if you follow along, the birthday cake comes out every 6 days or whatever, then you get some level of social interaction. You get some level of connection. You're put in one place with people. You're face to face with people. You have that just by default. In a remote setting, you can have all of that and then some, and in a much deeper and much richer way, or none of it at all if that's not what you want, but you have to design it intentionally. I spend a huge portion of my time online, and this is my social outlet. I don't have like this deep desire to be in a group setting doing structured group activities and things like that. Like the idea of being like in an office and celebrating birthdays together is something that like drives me, like that would drive me crazy being in that sort of setting. But I spend a huge portion of my day doing one-on-one conversations. I spend a huge portion of my day doing things like this, or, and I've never felt a shortage of professional or personal interactions with people. I have felt that you can definitely get in habits that get in the way of that, right? Like if you get busy as a remote worker because you're not going to a place and because other people are not seeing you and because there's not as clear of a work and life separation unless you put it there yourself. That can hurt, right? Like that could be where, I haven't called my friends in a while or my family in a while. I've been working weird hours, so on and so forth. Those are the things you got to look out for. So you need to design a schedule for yourself that gives you the kind of social interactions that you want and not assume that they're going to come from your professional contacts necessarily. They can come from an extended network of people who are working in positions similar to yours, or they're working in areas that are similar to what you serve through your software, or they're just people that you find interesting. As long as you're out on the internet somewhere doing something, you'll be able to catch up with people. If you look at meetups in most towns and most cities, there's going to be a meetup about something that's interesting to you. Or from a personal level, you can go to a library, you can go to a YMCA, whatever, but you do have to put that in place. Like you need to actually plan it. And this idea of like, as a remote worker, unless you're working underneath someone who's very experienced at this kind of thing and can put a lot of structure there for you, you are responsible for coming up with your own social plans. You are responsible for coming up with your own schedule. You are responsible for handling your own correspondence. You are responsible for demonstrating value continuously, because remote work only works when you can have trust, and you can only gain trust by actually delivering things, because you don't have that trust gaining by going out for the beer or the coffee or whatever. You only have the trust that's gained through delivery. And so you're responsible for delivering. You're responsible for actively going out and getting feedback from people. You're responsible for actively going out and figuring out what's on the horizon. You're responsible for staying in touch with people. You have to take care of yourself. You just got to take care of yourself. And now, after I've gone through that big list, it's like, do you really want to do remote work? Maybe not. It's fine. I mean, it is completely fine to weigh the trade-off and say, gee, I really would like the uninterrupted time of being able to work from home. But on the other hand, I think if I work from home, I'm not going to be able to make my schedule as well as I wish I could. I feel like I'm going to get distracted. I feel like I'm going to feel isolated. Then just don't do it. Like you don't get both. They're trade-offs. And you don't need to seek both. I think a lot of people who want remote work because they don't necessarily want to go in at a certain time every day. They don't want to wake up early and sit in traffic or whatever. It's like you'd be so much better served by just having like a performance-based workplace so that the number of hours you work is not what you're judged on. And B, even if you are going to have a set number of hours, a flexible schedule so that you can work them when you want. Because you can get like 90% of the flexibility benefits of a remote worker by being able to choose whether you want to come in at 8 a.m. or noon, right? Because then you could take 8 a.m. to noon and work on your own stuff or do stuff around the house or go out and engage in a hobby, whatever, and then go in for work from like 12 to 8 or whatever. Like, so don't confuse like wanting to have a flexible schedule and wanting to be evaluated based on performance rather than hours sitting in a chair with a desire to work from home or to work in a distributed team in which the office doesn't exist, because those are two very different things. It's like if the issue in your work is that there's too many meetings and you feel like that's a waste of time, that you're sitting around waiting for people to give you the feedback that they need on things, that you have people that are coming in and interrupting you and those sort of things, fix those problems, right? I mean, fix them and then keep going to the office, because there's a lot of advantages of being in an office, which I'm not going to talk too much about because I don't have a ton of experience with it, but there absolutely is benefit from having everybody in a room, right? Don't go to remote work because you're thinking, if I could just work from home, then people will leave me alone and I can get my work done. And then, especially if you're thinking like, all right, well, technically I'm supposed to work 8 hours a day, but if I'm working from home, I can work 2 hours or what. I mean, that's fine. If you can get your work done in a small amount of hours and then quit for the day, that's fine. But like, that means you need a flexible schedule, not that you need to be away from the eyes of people who expect you to be doing this sort of work. And I guess to add on that, an organization that's dysfunctional in a setting of having everybody in office is going to be doubly dysfunctional in a remote setting. Because if a team is really set up to support remote work well, then even when some people work on site, they'll all understand how remote work works and they'll be highly organized and it will be non-disruptive in various ways. And so then it shouldn't matter whether you're in the office or at home. But if you're thinking of going to remote work as an escape from the office setting, then that's not going to work unless you switch jobs. Because those problems of your office are not going to suddenly disappear when you go home. Now, on the idea of switching jobs, I think that for many people, if you're able to be responsible, if you're able to work for yourself and self-manage to some extent, even if you literally still work for a company, if you're able to take responsibility for yourself and build your own skills and be somewhat independent, then remote work is incredibly powerful for looking beyond your local area, and getting yourself in front of the whole world. The difficulty about this for most people is that if you don't have some measurable evidence that you're capable of doing that, and you are not active and present in the whole world, it's going to be hard to find remote work that's good remote work, because other people who are visible on the internet and have shown that they're capable of working remotely and producing things through whatever, open source, or through building products of their own, or through a portfolio of things that they had built with other teams, so on and so forth, are always going to have a lead. And so, like, to me, if I would like to hire someone for a remote position, I really hope that I met the person through the internet and saw them communicating on the internet, because, of course, if you can't present yourself well over a distributed communications medium, and in particular, if you can't present yourself well in a text-based asynchronous medium, and even more so in an actually building shit and putting it into the world sort of way, then you are an unknown quantity. And for me, like someone who gets all of their business through the internet and who does all of their output through the internet, when people come along and they're like, I'd like to do remote work because I don't like my job here. It's like, well, what have you done that is visible on the internet? And where are you? Like, if you're not talking to people and I can't see you talking to people, or if you haven't talked to me, or if you haven't built things, then you're not showing, you're not signaling that you have the skill set that's necessary for remote collaboration. And so the best advice that I could give to people who might want to get remote work is go out and, be on Twitter and talk to people who are in the field. Go out and actually build things and release them to the world. Go out and participate in chats and, Code Newbie or whatever. It doesn't matter. Like, anything that shows you working in a remote capacity with the world is super valuable. And it's important to say, like, you don't need to be out there saying, I'm better than everybody else. You don't need to be out there looking like you're the top 1% of whatever skill you're in the field. You just need to be showing that you have the capability to, like, work on your own and interact with people on the internet, because so many people there are many people who, if you sat down with them and you talked to them about the things that they've done, or you sat down with them and you actually worked with them on something, they're totally capable in this sort of, face-to-face setting, in this actual, like, structured setting of, like, direct interaction. Relatively few people have excellent written communication. Relatively few people have a bias towards publishing their work. Relatively few people build the extended network of connections that you need in order to support an online work lifestyle. Relatively few people have all of these skills. And so if I see someone with a mediocre skill set, but they're publishing and they're talking and they're engaging and they're learning, and you could see, if you look back 3 to 6 months back, because this is another great thing. Like, if you are remote and you're trying to gain remote work by promoting yourself in public, and when I say promote yourself, I don't mean hire me, but I mean by, like, doing stuff in public and then getting people to respond to it or not. I don't think anyone's watching this right now They are great. I don't care. It doesn't matter. I'm going to take this video, and if people watch it and they find something useful in it, awesome. But this will make 12 essays for me, because I'll pull out the bits and pieces of good stuff and write it, and then I'll share that. And maybe one of those will be seen by a bunch of people. It'll be like a 2-minute segment of this. These are the things you need to learn how to do. You need to learn how to put it all out there and then chop and dice and slice and dice and find the pieces that are good and then serve those up. And then you have to show a track record of like learning and growing and improving and changing over time and not giving up and not just building and building and building and building. And as you do that, you learn what people respond to. As you do that, you learn yourself. I mean, that's the wonderful thing about if you're doing your work through the internet, and if you're doing enough work in public that you can share, then you have the whole history, right? Like I can go back 6 months and see where you were 6 months ago. And it's like, I could see how much you've developed over time. I could see your whole process. And when you see that, then it becomes very obvious, like, okay, that's a person that seems like they know how to communicate with others. That's a person that's looking like they're going to grow, so on and so forth. And so I think I'm going to stop here, because this has been like a very unstructured ramble, but I'm happy to talk to people more about things like this anytime. And I think as I dig a little bit deeper, because honestly, it's funny, I've worked remotely for my entire life, and I think I'm actually pretty good at it, and I think I've refined that work over time. But I haven't spent a lot of time talking about it, and I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about it as a thing on its own, because it's just like, it's my natural environment. It's what I do. But I think there's probably quite a bit here, and I need to start digging. And this first video was like just a brain dump of some of those concepts. And I think if I go back, cut it up into pieces, there's probably things that we could dig into a little more. So if you happen to watch this and you want to talk more, just talk to me. Video is not my best format. You can tweet at me or send me an email or whatever. And then from there, take this a little farther. All right. Bye.